Okie dokie. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here tonight. First let's do housekeeping. Yeah. Okay, so we've been a little out of sorts since well, really June, with consistency. So we're gonna try to start changing that. I'm gonna start grabbing things. Also, don't stop. Stream marker. Couldn't add stream marker. Okay, doesn't work. Never mind. Anyway, we're doing a lot of sorts of things. So what we're going to try to do is something along the lines of 2 to 3 streams a week, and take an old stream or stream segment and turn it into a VOD at least once a week to try to bring some consistency to this endeavor. So with that, I'm going to start here tonight. We're going to be talking about a couple different things, all of which I can segment, which is nice. And then we'll go from there. The first thing that's up on the agenda this evening, however, is a news story that was quietly filed away under the Army Times yesterday. Maybe not yesterday in particular, but that's when I finally saw it. I don't know. Why would you make a Blue Falcon a thing for your podcast? So in particular, what we're looking at here is a court case regarding the Texas National Guard and federal readiness standards. Also, guys, let me know if the audio is okay. So, for anyone who's not aware, the National Guard, the Army Reserve, and the regular Army are 3 different things. If you're in the regular Army, the Army is in your full-time job. You are paid by the federal government, and they do, in fact, get to set the rules and regulations for the United States Army. The Army Reserve is quite similar to the regular Army, with the exception that it is not your full-time job. It is part-time, 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks out of the year, similar to the National Guard, except that you are, again, paid out of the federal government's pocket, and the federal government gets to set the standards by which you are able to operate. Excuse me. Now, the National Guard is different. And National Guards are probably better understood as a plural system. So National Guardsmen are employed by the state that they live in. They are controlled by the government, but the National Guards themselves are largely funded by the state government. Or, excuse me, largely funded by the federal government. And in return, the federal government has traditionally, at least since the 1980s or so, been able to set training and readiness standards for the National Guard. This is really useful for you living in an American state, because the National Guard is typically the first response for really serious natural disasters. So it helps to know that they are ready at a certain level of readiness. What has been happening in Texas is Governor Abbott wants to take it so that you cannot force a National Guardsman to get a COVID vaccine, which has been an ongoing problem for the military since 2020. They mandated a COVID vaccine, and a whole bunch of soldiers, deciding that this was their opportunity to get out of the military, decided to start objecting to vaccines on religious grounds, which is ridiculous on account of the fact that they are required to get vaccines to join the military. So if you got vaccines when you started, it's time for you to lay down. When you got vaccines when you've started, and you all of a sudden, your sincerity might come into doubt. But nevertheless, the Army turned around and gave people a discharge if they did not want to receive the vaccine. No. If they did not want to receive the vaccine. Lay down. Someone is being needy today. he has to go to the vet on Monday. I accidentally took him today. Didn't realize the appointment was on Monday. Oops. ADD is a wonderful thing. Anyway, so traditionally, the National Guard has kind of been a hot potato between the state and the federal government. But the 80s rolled around, and the federal government effectively said, we're paying for the Guard, we can set readiness standards, which is not unreasonable. So like the National Guard uses Army equipment, and it vastly simplifies obtaining it as well, if you have one source where it's being ordered from and then dispersed. Sorry. One source where it's being ordered and dispersed. Now, the National Guard is, in reality, the extension of a state militia, really, what it is. So, it has a somewhat nebulous existence. However, hang on a second. Go. Sorry about that. Anyway, it is. It's not hard to get the shots. At any rate, these are just people who very clearly, like, I had this conversation with someone who was working in the Pentagon at the time, is they do not want those people back. Those people did not want to be in the military, and everyone is much happier with them gone. So this is a ridiculous bit. At any rate, it also probably should be noted that other states, not all states, but some states have an additional state guard, which is useless and not counted as anything defense-wise. The problem we have here, hey Bluestone, the problem we have here is that there is a judge, a circuit judge, at least 2 out of 3 of a circuit judge, who have ruled that there is a possibility that federal readiness standards cannot be applied to state National Guards. This sort of creates an issue, because right now what you have is a single source, the Department of Defense, making decisions for readiness for everyone. So irrespective of what happens, you can be guaranteed that a National Guardsman that comes from Alabama is the same trained as one that comes from Illinois, from Washington, from Virginia, etc. If the federal government is not allowed to enforce these standards, any governor can take any standard they do not like for any reason. And, oh, I like ads not loading. Oh, damn it. And turn around and say, I don't want to do this, which turns military readiness for the home front units into a political pancake. They don't, or a political hot potato rather. They don't have, there's no guarantee that the Guard is able to function effectively. So, suppose you're in a state prone to hurricanes and you're flooding, and all of a sudden the National Guard hasn't had to maintain their boats properly, and they try to rescue you and you sink in the middle of a thing. Like anything, like any of these things is just something that can become disastrous for American citizens. And that's not good. So we shouldn't do that. And it's ridiculous because they're having a fight over a vaccine which we know works. And we know that the efficacy of vaccines is not really in question. So this is Republicans continuing to try to sabotage our institutions for the sake of political expediency. And I don't particularly like it much. Well, Territorial Defense Force would be its equivalent, I guess, in Ukraine. you'd still have the same problem. There wouldn't necessarily. The National Guard is convenient for the American government because it allows them to have, a separate standing army. A territorial defense force would just be a lesser army. It'd be kind of a nightmare. The thing is already extant now as a National Guard, so there's no reason to make it something different. Anyway, I'm going to go over parts of this article. States who once held near total control over their militias sacrificed autonomy on the altar of the federal financial fire hose. Actually, it's probably not entirely true. Anytime the militia was required in its early years, it was basically placed under federal control. Particularly like War of 1812, which gave the Defense Department leverage to shape the Guard in the image of its full-time counterparts. In return, governors now have highly trained forces at their disposal for missions at home, and they're using them more than ever. This is true. We've seen some inappropriate uses of the Guard, I think, like teaching students or border patrol work. All of which is allowed to happen because of some ambiguity in the law. So the American military is not allowed to be police, per the Posse Comitatus Act. But the National Guard is not, strictly speaking, military. Unless it's activated by the federal government, in which case it is. So you can kind of sort of use them roughly the same, and they occupy this middle ground. Both sides have benefited from this deal since 1990, when the Supreme Court unanimously decided the last major legal battle in favor of the Department of Defense. But the deal may soon be dead, experts say, after a recent court ruling in Texas Governor Greg Abbott's legal fight against the Pentagon's COVID-19 vaccine mandate. What the ruling essentially says is that state compliance with federal guidelines is completely voluntary, said Jeff Jacobs, a retired Army Reserve two-star general, attorney, and author of a 1994 book analyzing the Guard's dual control structure. And the only recourse the federal government has, because Texas did not dispute this, is to withdraw funding for the state's National Guard, which is also probably an issue for Texas because Texas already can't afford to operate Texas. They also probably couldn't afford to operate the Guard in addition to operating Texas. Jacobs warned that this decision, at its logical conclusion, allows governors to block military personnel requirements, offering free rein to protect non-federalized Guard members from military punishments from everything from marijuana use to fitness tests. But even under the ruling, troops must meet all federal requirements to join. Yeah, the Fifth Circuit is horrible. It gives governors a veto to play politics with single thing the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of the Army or Air Force, because the Air Force has their own National Guard component, due. Both the DoD and the National Guard Bureau declined to comment. Of course they did. Citing ongoing litigation. They don't really have much of an option. They just have to sort of sit here and take it because they can't get involved. They don't have power of the purse to take away that funding from any National Guard. So they're kind of stuck. I'm not entirely certain I would have asked them for a comment. The Abbott administration, later joined by asked a federal judge in Tyler, Texas, to block the DoD's vaccine mandate in January of 2022, which I would point out that the federal judge probably doesn't actually have authority to do. Nor do the states really have standing to do that either, or at least they shouldn't, because the states don't get to administer the federal government's the states don't get to dictate to the federal government what is and is not the law. We have become way overly permissive in what we're letting Republican states do, and we're going to talk about that in the next bit too. Responding to the governors, the federal government contended that it has the authority to set readiness requirements and enforce them. They contend in order to receive federal pay and federal benefits, even when in state-controlled, federally funded Title 32 status, members of the Guard needed to comply with federal readiness requirements. Not unreasonable. If you're going to be called upon to do a job, then you should have to demonstrate that you can do it. After in-person arguments in June 2022, District Judge J. Campbell Barker denied the governor's request for a preliminary injunction, which is probably correct because he would have looked back at the previous system and said, or the previous ruling and said, this is how we did it in the past. Therefore, what? The Abbott administration appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, a result which could upend federal control of the bar. A panel of 3 judges unanimously voted to vacate or undo Barker's denial of the preliminary injunction. The lower district judge must reconsider the matter in the months ahead, and a final resolution could be years away. This is going to take some time. The federal government's probably going to take this all the way to the Supreme Court if they lose. How that would go, it would be anyone's guess, really. In a June 12th opinion written by the Circuit Judge Andrew Oldham and signed into part Don Willett, left little to the imagination. Oldham, who was appointed by former President Donald Trump, of course, ascended on a 50-49 vote, of course, and was Abbott's lawyer, so he didn't bother to recuse himself. The President of the United States asserts power to punish. Hang on a second. Thank you. Asserts the power to punish members of the tax who have not been called into national service. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, however, deny him that power. I don't think so. Oldham disagreed. He analyzed the Constitution's militia clauses, which were 1780's power-sharing compromise between the federal government and the states. The states feared the potential tyranny of a federal government with a large standing army. Yes, and this is going to come into... Trump did get so many judicial appointments. But the Federalists, who favored a strong central government, argued that Congress needed to defend the country. Under that bargain, the state militia had state-appointed officers and remained under state control on a day-to-day basis, though the federal government set their training standards. Okay, the federal government set their training standards. What are we arguing about? It seems pretty clear to me. The central government also gained absolute power over the militia and its members if and when it was ordered into federal service to repel invasions or suppress insurrections. That's pretty much it. Federal government gets to say you have to do this. That's the end of the story. Yeah, here's the problem. Trump justices, and this is really the end of the story. Yeah, there are a couple things. There are a couple problems here. Like, they'll talk about the physical fitness test, and that's a big deal in the military. But basic things, like, we've already seen perfect evidence that people like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott are not capable of making decisions for the good of their states, let alone the good of the rest of the country, that may be subject to action by the Texas National Guard or the Florida National Guard. So this is a not inconsiderably huge problem. This is not what you want to be playing hot potato with if you are facing a period of increased natural disasters due to climate change, for example, or increased amounts of storms of the century, or what have you. All of this is going to present a very severe problem, and it does seem to me at least based on having read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, that the Trump-appointed judge is just ignoring the law and the tradition in the tradition it is supposed to, like, the whole point of, having, what's the word I'm looking for? This is a bad time to be called stupid. Having a government, or having law precedent. Like, we have precedent here. And this is kind of the problem. When people say, I don't want to vote because I feel both parties are the same, or I don't want to vote because the Democrats are not radical enough, is the Republicans are radical enough. And the Republicans do not care about tradition. They do not care about precedent. They do not care about any of these things which we rely on to make the system work. They only care about invalidating the work that Democrats do, because they do not view Democrats as legitimate. So they will do anything necessary to undo those things. So let's say, even if you don't like the Democrats, that arguably the Democrats are not the worst problem here, that arguably the Republicans are. So even if you don't think the Democrats are going to do enough, it behooves you to vote for them, because not voting is a tacit approval for the Republicans to do what they're doing. So Trump sat and he got all these judicial appointments, and McConnell sat and he stole judicial appointments out from underneath of Obama, and then flagrantly violated his own principles when it came time to appoint Ruth Bader Ginsburg's replacement. And that clearly tells you that they just want to win. So this is why it's, people say it's important to vote, because things get a lot worse. Like, this is the kind of thing that people don't think is going to be an issue until it becomes an issue. And by the time it becomes an issue, you don't have an alternative. It's too late to undo this. When Texas gets hit by another hurricane and they need their National Guard to be funded and ready to go, and they're not because of this nonsense, it's too late. The horse has left the barn. And what you're left with is just a ridiculous problem. We're having this fight, and it will go away. It will go away as soon as a Republican comes to the presidency. And more importantly, as soon as they put a completely unqualified person at the helm for the Secretary of Defense. Why not? Bad. And that just sort of brings us to the next part of today's adventure. The state of Florida, under Ron DeSantis, has decided that it's going to ban driver's license from a number of states. A list of out-of-state driver's licenses that are no longer banned in Florida due to a new law supposed to be cracking down on illegal immigration. As of July 1st, these out-of-state driver's licenses are no longer valid in Florida if the driver is in the U.S. illegally. First of all, Delaware, Connecticut, Hawaii, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Someone who is in our country illegally and violated our laws should not possess a government-issued ID, which allows them access to state-funded services and other privileges afforded to lawful residents. Here's the problem with this. The United States Constitution is held up as the supreme law of the land. It's called the Supremacy Clause. In the Constitution, there's something called the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, judicial proceedings of every other state. And Congress may, by general laws, prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved, and the effect thereof. So, yeah, well, that's actually exactly what will happen for a lot of people. And what will also happen is a lot of people who are here illegally um, will be targeted, ticketed, etc., and not allowed to work or access services because they will be, unfortunately, illegally targeted. The full faith and credit clause is designed so that if I do something in one state, it counts in the next state. This applies to almost everything you can get from a state level. So, like, if you get married in one state, you are considered married in another state, which is what was used a lot when there was gay marriage was a patchwork. Is they would go to one state where it was legal, and you come back count as married in the other state. The full faith and credit clause also applies to driver's license. It's why you don't have to get a special license to drive in another state when you go out of state. It's designed to facilitate these things, so that you don't have to overly burden yourself moving from state to state to state. Florida and Ron DeSantis does not have the necessary authority to invalidate a driver's license issued by another state. And here's the thing about Ron DeSantis is Ron DeSantis is clearly an idiot and utterly uncharismatic. But the problem is he thinks that he has sufficient cover in the courts because of how many judges Trump got in, that he can take this and win it. Otherwise, he wouldn't do it. And the other problem is that what's going to happen is this isn't going to be, maybe, hopefully, another state will sue him. But what will probably happen is that a resident of that state who holds that driver's license will sue Ron DeSantis and the government of Florida. And an enormous personal cost to themselves, an enormous personal cost to Florida taxpayers, who indirectly are paid by American federal taxpayers because Florida's a red state, and they take in more money than they earn in taxes. We are all going to pay for something that is so flagrantly illegal to be decided in a court over a series of years in order for Ron DeSantis to fuel his what will be a failed run for the White House, because he's going to get squished by Donald Trump, which is sad when you think about it, because Donald Trump is like 2 steps away from jail. And this is like been a pattern for Florida. Like, they're doing these things that are flagrantly illegal. If you remember when they sent a group of undocumented individuals to Martha's Vineyard, where they tricked them and trafficked them over to Martha's Vineyard in order to take and make a political statement. And this was very clearly outrageous. But this is not unprecedented. The Supremacy Clause has been challenged in American history by the states at various times. Perhaps most famously during the Civil War, when 11 states decided to secede from the Union and were told, no, you can't do that, and we're going to make you stay anyway, and got their asses kicked. But leading up to, I don't know if they did it again recently. I was thinking of the one from a couple months ago. Leading up to that, what you had, a particular event was prior to the Civil War in 1832, that came to be known as the nullification crisis. And the nullification crisis was a tiff between South Carolina over a set of instituted tariffs that they didn't agree with. The tariffs are were officially named the Tariff Act of 1828 and 1832. They called them the Tariffs of Abominations because people in the South were ridiculous at this time. The president at this time was Andrew Jackson, who I would note as a slave owner and part of the South's aristocracy, and benefited immensely from the South being elected. And what happened is South Carolina declared that they have unilateral power to nullify any federal law that they do not like. This, as you might imagine, was not the position of the federal government, not the position of the signers of the Constitution, and also broadly understood by the Anti-Federalists to not be possible back when the Constitution was being ratified. This is less than ideal, because if you can just ignore the law any time you want, you end up having anarchy and chaos, and that's not useful. So Andrew Jackson said, "Nuh-uh." The problem is that this particular legal doctrine was being advanced by John C. Calhoun, who was Andrew Jackson's vice president at the time. And at this point in American history, the vice president is basically the person who comes in second in the electoral college. So what you usually ended up having happen is one person wins the presidency, and the person who is opposed to him takes up the vice presidency. So what Calhoun does in 1832, in middle 1832, is he resigns the vice presidency and runs for Senate in North Carolina, where later in the year, in November, they adopt an ordinance of nullification, which prompted the federal government to turn around and pass a law that would allow Andrew Jackson to send troops into South Carolina and take control. Which promptly got South Carolina to come and talk, and a compromise tariff was reached. And twas ever thus, although, again, 30 years later, we have the Civil War, so maybe it wasn't ever thus. However, the problem is that this is kind of basically the same thing. A governor is deciding to nullify a part of the Constitution that they feel is not, they don't have to follow. And that's not true. So, this is going to sit very quietly. Again, it's going to be resolved in the courts. What they should do is take the Georgia National Guard and federalize it, the Florida National Guard and federalize it, and arrest Ron DeSantis for treason, and see how he feels then. I think that will do a couple things. First, it'll put a real damper on his efforts to, take control of and erase educational standards for the state. It'll put a real damper on his efforts to kill trans people. And it'll put a real damper on his efforts to subvert the Constitution. And Florida won't have to be invaded by Disney, which actually would be fun. This is kind of where we get our clickbaity title for the evening. What you have is Republican governors deliberately trying to undermine key parts of the American Constitution in order for short-term political gain. This is not a state of affairs that can continue for long without being answered. No, absolutely, lock him up. I have a feeling that if the United States was a little bit more zealous in prosecuting people for things like this, we wouldn't be in this particular situation. Let's just look. Excuse me. What is the oath of office for the governor of Florida? I, a citizen of the state of Florida and the United States of America, and being employed by or an officer of and a recipient of public funds, such as an employee or officer, do hereby solemnly swear that I will affirm that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the state of Florida. It is clearly a dual oath.
Hyundai Sonata versus Toyota Camry. Look what's...
No. Let's get rid of that. It is clearly a dual oath that requires him to acknowledge the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution. He hasn't done this. He has broken his oath. He should basically no longer be the governor of Florida. It's that simple. Take him, lock him up, deport him, do anything. Long story short, bye. Like, to a certain extent, the United States and a lot of countries operate on reciprocity. You do your part, we do our part. If they decide no longer to do their part and to abide by those requirements, then it should be that they are done, that it's over. Go away. The full faith and credit clause. Ron DeSantis should know this. He's a lawyer. Should also know the supremacy clause. If there's a conflict, federal law wins. It's really that simple. This isn't hard. And by trying to pretend that it's hard, we are undermining the ability of people to operate in this country. We're undermining people's confidence that their government is going to protect them from abuses. And let's be really clear. Most people who are exposed to abuses are exposed to them on a state and a local level. Particularly in this rising environment where you see a whole lot more laws that are explicitly targeting trans individuals. Like, this isn't the federal government that's being, tyrannical. It's their neighbors that are being tyrannical. And we have remedies for these things. So this is why you vote, even if you don't agree with the way that voting is set up, the way these systems work. Because we've made Democrats the cowards who think that we won't have their back if they take strong measures to protect Americans. So this is why you vote. Because when we don't vote, and when people feel like they're sitting out there with their asses hanging out, what happens is people in other places suffer when they don't have to. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Democrats would do one thing one way or the other. But they certainly won't do it if they don't think that people are going to have their backs. Working a couple things here too. No, Ed, go away. Anna Kasparian's been done to death. We're not going to talk about that. More to the point, there's nothing really to say. Or at least nothing useful to say. I'm going to put up something that reacts to it a little bit too. Let's go back into my backlog of things. But first, who was watching Sunday last night and his cathedral person debate? Anybody? 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 Fine, chat, be quiet. See if I care. While we were talking about cathedrals and crusades, and the interlocutor brought up, no, what are you doing? You're fine. Go lay down. This is silly. You've been petted all day. Yeah, I was mentioning the Crusades and just war theory. So what just war theory is a set of criteria that philosophers or theologians, it really depends on who's doing what when, have established for when a war is just, as in justice, just. Just war theory is a big topic in ethics because it depends on when you're talking about the theory, when it is considered, when what is considered just. But what's commonly accepted today is the definition by St. Augustine. St. Augustine put forth a number of criteria that qualifies a war as being just. And the first is that the war must be called for by a competent authority. Only duly constituted public authorities may wage war. And this has to be So there's basically two ways to violate this criteria. The first is that you have to lay down. The first is that you have to turn around. You have to lay down in your bed, Bubba. Come on. Someone's being needy today. The first is that if you are a dictatorship, you cannot be considered a competent authority of the people to wage war. So Putin is right out. The second is if the cause for war is deceptive, such as you say that the country has chemical weapons and they do not have chemical weapons, then that takes away your competency as an authority of the people to declare war. The second is that if you are going to go to war, there has to be a strong chance that your nation will succeed at its war aims. So you cannot go to war and try to take all of Ukraine when you're not capable of taking half of Ukraine, for example. The idea of this criteria is to avoid someone invading you and starting a war for the sake of doing it. The third criteria, then, is going to be that this must be a last resort. So every single nonviolent option has to be exhausted prior to you engaging it in a war. So, more accurately, a small intervention is preferable to a general war. And the last criteria prior to entering a war is that the war must be for a cause that is just. So you cannot go to war to recapture lost territory. You cannot go to war to take things from a ruler in order to punish them. have to go to war to right an imminent grave threat to human life. Now, once you are in war, there are additional criteria. The first one is that you have to make a distinct effort to not target non-combatants. The second one is that your conduct in the war has to be governed by a sense of proportionality. So you cannot turn around and cause outrageously greater damage to a country than you have in yourself been subject to. For example, if defending yourself from invasion. Actions have to be taken as matters of military necessity. So terror bombing civilians, not militarily necessary. Hey, Connor. Is this working or is it going off and on? We're covering just warfare right now. And finally, the final two is that you have to treat prisoners of war fairly. And you have to not use weapons that are considered so deliberately designed weapons of war that are designed to inflict horrific casualties. You might notice, if we're talking about that you can probably think of several cases in which all of this has been thrown out the window multiple times since St. Augustine. And in fairness to Augustine, I'm not sure he could fully imagine everything that he would have been capable of just 100 years later from his period. So, or from his life. So, really, Sunday's interlocutor last night, and Brooks' interlocutor, and everyone should tell Brooks that he looks like Rasputin, said that he thought that the First Crusade was justified. You're going to notice right off the bat there are a couple problems with this. So if you're not familiar, the First Crusades start around the closing period of the 1090s. And what happens is that the caliphates took over Jerusalem, and this upset the Christians in Western Europe, who then decided to get together to form a Roman Crusade army and go take back Jerusalem. Along the way, they burned down Constantinople, which was great for them. So, what does the Crusades not qualify for? The first is that the Crusades are not methods of last resort. They were methods of first resort. The second is that this was not a just cause. It was explicitly to retake territory. They turned out to be successful against all possible odds, so that was interesting. Competent authority is kind of tricky, because the Crusade itself is called by the Pope. The Crusade itself is called by the Pope, and is it dying? Are we? How about now? Okay, yeah. So, even entering into this, the First Crusade was not really just in any real sense, at least according to Christian philosophy. The second part is that it was waged brutally. The Crusaders arriving to your town was not good news for you, irrespective of who you were. That's largely because they had to march the eastern half of the Roman Empire to get there. Yeah, we're not going to be sitting up forever. My back will kill me. I'll figure something out. Largely due to the fact that there's not much respect with Western Europe and the Eastern Roman Empire because they're trying to legitimize the concept of the Holy Roman Empire. And there's a whole lot of love lost between Orthodox Christians and Catholics at this point too, or what would be called Catholics. So, like, was the Crusades just war? A just war? Not really, at any point. You're probably honestly better off in that period of time being a Christian in Muslim lands anyway, because you basically just have to pay a tax to be Christian, as opposed to the kind of brutal treatment you can guarantee that you're going to get if you're a Christian or a Muslim in Christian lands in the period. A la Spain. Why is this on my list? All right, so we're going to finish this out with something I kind of stuck on the back burner because I wanted to do it. If you're not familiar with Mr. Terry History, he is a React channel, so we're going to be reacting to a React because I'm unfortunately meta. Will this work this time? Go. Okay. YouTube is busted. We're going to be reacting to a React channel. Mr. Terry History is a history teacher who I believe teaches high school. I'm not sure. And what we're going to look is Slavery Misdebunked, 10 Lies You've Been Told About Slavery. The Cynical Historian, who's actually pretty good. I do believe that the Cynical Historian just got his PhD. So, good for you.
Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today's topic is going to be on common slavery myths. And the video I wanted to check out and comment on is going to be coming from the Cynical Historian, which is actually my first time reacting to his channel, even though I've known him for a long time now. And his video is simply called 10 Common Slavery Myths. The slavery trade is something I've always very much been interested in and learning about it, not just from like the Atlantic slave trade position, but really the whole history of it and how it has been done in different places of the world at different times. And there's a good chance that there is a slavery myth that you probably believe in. So we're going to be checking out the Cynical Historian's video on this, and I'm going to be adding my stuff as always. All right, please support this original creator. He's a great friend of the community. The video link is going to be down below. Make sure you're supporting that, and make sure you're subbing to Cynical Historian. He also just wrapped up his PhD. Congrats on that, buddy. All right, let's get to it.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, another thing I'd like to know in the comments is, are any of these myths that are going to be talked about, are these things that you've seen in your classrooms before? Those are definitely things I'm interested in as a teacher to make sure, you know, those myths don't keep getting regurgitated. It's an old-timey video.
We've got to do something about our production values.
Hey, Safer here. There are a lot of misconceptions surrounding the institution of slavery, especially here in the United States. These myths often serve pernicious political purposes that can be highly detrimental to a proper conception of history. So here are...
Yes, 1,000 times yes. The history of slavery has been politicized so much by every point of view that it's...
No, okay, let's be really clear here. It's been principally politicized by a single point of view, and that's going to be neo-Confederates. To the point, like, I'd argue that most people who aren't engaging with neo-Confederate ideology aren't really engaging with the history of slavery at all, because it is so prevalent in our teaching that we teach this kind of watered down variant of it in order to satisfy neo-Confederates, that you end up, oh, we're only a minute in, but it's going to be a long one, that you end up with a very biased view of how slavery works. And so you have to do a lot of course correcting. And this is kind of the thing too, like generally, history is very often affected, at least in the United States, by conservative ideology. So, hopefully this mic is close enough at this range to be, loud. You're stuck with conservative ideology, and what we've been trying to do is undo this biased teaching of history, and that's where a lot of the pushback comes from.
Naturally, probably hard to keep track of it and know what's true or not.
10 of those myths debunked in no particular order. Since they aren't in a particular order, each one is fairly different from the other, so you should stick around.
Oh, okay, here they are. White slaves in America. America invented slavery. I hope nobody thinks that. The first slave owner in America was black. The Union fought in slavery. Fought to end slavery. The South seceded over states' rights. Lost cause theory, right? Few Southerners owned slaves. Factory workers were like slaves. Black soldiers fought for the Confederacy. Africans were captured by Europeans, and white people ended slavery. Okay.
Because the list goes all over the place. Just as an aside, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the US because this is where the myths serve their most malignant political purpose. If you are someone who is offended,
On one hand, I see why. Here's the thing: slavery is distinct to its period and its time, and its region. So, like, Roman slavery is distinct from American slavery, is distinct from slavery in the United Kingdom to a much lesser extent. Is distinct from slavery over in Asia. Is distinct from, and distinct from slavery, for example, at different time periods as well. So, like, in order to talk about the enslavement of people, you kind of have to localize it. Otherwise, you can't really say anything of value about the topic.
offended by these facts, check my sources. As per usual, they are in the description.
This is where he's very much an academic in his background, again, getting PhD and stuff. And it was fun. I got to be interviewed for one of his videos and stuff like that. And he was, talking to me about his, PhD and what he was researching. Awesome stuff there. So, all right. Okay. First one, white slaves in America. Are we talking indentured servitude or what?
It is a common meme going around the internet. Anytime a Black Lives Matter issue comes up, I'll see people putting these up on Facebook. Well, these
Pause
are
my video if you want to see all these. I won't stop on all these memes up there.
all wrong. White slaves did exist, but not in the American colonies. Mostly on the Barbary Coast, where Muslim corsairs would capture and enslave whites. In the New World, the closest whites got to being enslaved was indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is a system in which one is forced to labor for a limited period of time. Sometimes there were cruel bosses, but there were many more laws protecting against cruel masters of indentured servants than slaves. And there was, in fact, a legal difference. Also, sometimes people were sentenced to indentured servitude for crimes they had committed. Their contracts could even be sold by owners. But generally, these contracts would only be for 5 to 20 years. Slavery, indentured servitude, was not. Some might call indentured servants sentenced to life slavery, but that would be like calling a modern prisoner sentenced to life a slave.
Yeah, especially if they'd entered.
So there is a certain distinction to make here, in particular for America. the 13th Amendment allows for slavery in the use of incarceration. My understanding of our prison system is that a number of prisoners engage in work on a daily basis and are paid for this work, but they are paid far below market value, which may not technically be slavery, but is exploitative. And on the face of it being exploitative, you have a second problem, particularly in the United States, within our prison system, is that the vast majority of our prisoners are people of color, because we commonly criminalize those things which people of color are more likely to have committed, as opposed to criminalizing more stringently things that people who are more well off would have committed. And this is a case of confounding problems. Stop eating the box. Come here. Lay down. Someone wants much more attention than he is getting today. So what you have is, for example, the distinction between powder and crack cocaine and prison sentences is people who are poorer tend to use one over the other, which is more heavily criminalized. And those people who are poorer tend to also be people of color, because of the legacy of redlining and racism, making it much more difficult for them to be socially mobile. So like, taken together, it sort of replicates the same problem to a similar degree, but it is not the same thing, totally the same thing. You're just left with a de facto system of segregation and exploitation, as opposed to a de jure one. So indentured servitude is effectively an ended practice, I think, here for us. And there was significant legal protections on it, which is true. However, this kind of relationship is ripe for abuses, irrespective of... What? Come here. Come here. Stop being annoying. Irrespective of the legal definitions. Like, all three basic relationships, slavery obviously still exists. All three relationships are not something we should, leave in the world uncontested.
To agreement that did have a time frame on there. So one question would be, if you're asking yourself, why would somebody enter into indentured servitude? One thing could be as the Americas were becoming more populated, and the British, speaking mostly to the British 13 colonies here, it was a very lucrative thing for people to come over. But you got to understand that, like, not everybody can pause their life, like if you're in Europe, and have the money and the means to just hop on a ship over to North America and then find a piece of land. All that, it'd be very, very expensive. So like the first people coming over, that especially want to invest in land, they're not poor people. So like the question would be then, what if you didn't have that startup money to move over and get land? One way to do that was to enter yourself in indentured servitude, right? So you are going to work for someone on some land, and then
I want to check something real quick. Yeah, indentured servitude. One of the principal problems with it is it did not leave those indentured servants in a strong position. In order to participate in colonial society. Basically, you have to own large tracts of land, which you're not going to be able to do as an indentured servant, even post that indentured servitude.
You contract yourself over to them. Then when that term is up, you may be able to get some land for yourself or something like that.
It's a big part of this.
You're paying a debt, right? And you're working that off to eventually be a freed landowner, right? And the contracts can
You might be a freed landowner.
vary a lot depending on what you're going to get out of it. But largely, again, it was seen as a good investment in yourself. If you didn't have the means on your own to go and buy land, work off a debt to someone, where then you can get land, and then you get your full freedom.
That's just weird. This myth tends to focus on the Irish, who did in fact suffer tremendously under English rule. Some could be said to have been put into serfdom, but that was in the old world. In the new one, the closest they came to slavery was indentured servitude, and it was generally voluntary, not coerced. Nor were they treated more brutally than black slaves.
There were also a lot of push factors for Ireland. I mean, later on, you also have things like the Irish potato famine, which was
the other major part of that particular comparison is indentured servitude ends. And you'd also be hard-pressed to be treated more brutally than being treated as property. And particularly the virulent racism that emerges from the enslavement of blacks in America.
Killing so many people in Ireland, and they had to flee, and they weren't going to go to Britain. America invented slavery. Okay, nobody thinks this, right?
The invention of slavery predates history itself. While it is generally incorrect to say that ancient Persian and Egyptian states practiced slavery, we know from their records that slavery existed in surrounding states. Furthermore, there is archaeological evidence that shows it was a common practice throughout the world.
Yeah. And in a lot of societies. Persia was kind of, famous for that, of not using that type of labor. Which also gives great press in places like the Bible, where Persia comes in and for the Jews, and they get kind of liberated there and that kind of thing. But yeah,
nearly every place in
I can't imagine. I don't think I've ever heard someone say slavery was invented in America. I'm not sure I'd count this. There's a lot of evidence for people spreading the Irish myth thing, but this kind of seems like both sidings for both sidings' sake.
In the world had slavery at some point in its history or prehistory. Chattel slavery, as in the practice of hereditary race-based enslavement, was something that was practiced throughout the Middle East and Asian steppe for centuries prior to 1492. In fact,
chattel slavery, by the way, is where you are seen as actual property of the slave owner. You are their property, and that is not always the case for slavery. Sometimes you're not seen as property. A lot of times, again, in history, slaves are not even enslaved for their whole lives. In some cultures, the slaves actually assimilate into the culture and basically become like
So the most prominent example of what he's talking about would be Roman slaves who had a practice of manumission, or the freeing of slaves. And even if it would be incorrect to say that this was not a property distinction, if you were, for example, in a culture where manumission was a common practice for slaves, where manumission was a practice for slaves, for example, ancient Rome, you would have a case where that slave is owned by the person who is the slave owner. They are manumitted, for example, most commonly when the slave owner dies, and they themselves become a free person. However, they are not a Roman citizen. They're not integrated into the society in that way. Their children are integrated into the society. and for the period of time that they are a slave, they are still property. So manumission in and of itself does not take away the distinction of taking a person as property, and doesn't make it better, so to speak.
Family members, a lot of different versions of slavery.
Much of Islamic states practiced it.
It's a little too general to be a helpful answer.
Until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, and some well after that. The last African country to abolish slavery
Nigeria?
was Mauritania, and it
Mauritania.
happened in 1981,
the north,
and it is
yeah.
still a problem for many countries. Several countries, especially Mauritania, still have
Sorry, I didn't mean- I meant
illegal
Saudi
and
Arabia,
de
not-
facto
not
slavery,
Algeria.
since the government is
Which is kind of common to, for example, the United States banned the import of new slaves per the Constitution 20 years after the fact, after the ratification of the Constitution. However, there was still a black market importation of new people to be enslaved. On the flip side, that wasn't strictly speaking necessary, because so many people had been imported to be enslaved at that point, and their descendants were being also enslaved, that they could basically breed themselves new slaves, which they did in huge numbers.
unwilling to enforce its mandates against slavery, many people still hold slaves today. European empires, such as the Greeks and Romans, had practiced slavery and were crucial to their economies.
You mentioned earlier about the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire also had a kind of interesting policy for slavery too. In Islamic law, you could have slaves, but they can't be other Muslims. And the common thing for the Ottoman Empire was, one of them most famously was Christian boys, especially from the Balkan area, Serbia, that kind of area. So they were seen as legal in the legal sense of that. But then interestingly, like some of them, like the Janissaries, were taken from there, and then they were basically slaves, but they were also like pretty much like had the Christianity kind of brainwashed out of them, and then were basically forced to become Muslims, and also incredibly devout ones because they answered directly to the Sultan. Interesting story there, but that's a kind of a policy.
It would probably be worth noting at that point that Janissaries were also soldiers, particularly employed in that elite status for the Ottoman Empire. So they had a vested interest in keeping them loyal to the state religion.
Policy for Islam is not to enslave other Muslims.
The only real reason why they stopped was that the system of serfdom implemented after the Roman Empire made slavery kind of unnecessary for a while.
Serfs basically were slaves. I mean, they were bound.
That's a really fuzzy distinction. Serfs are bound to the land, and they do not enjoy the freedom of mobility that you and I enjoy, for example. But at the same time, one of the things that sets feudalism apart is that there is a series of relationships at play. A serf works the land for a lord who in turn provides protections for those serfs. There is a expectation of behavior placed upon a lord that they must do these things, and they must pay fealty to a king or a higher lord, etc., etc., etc. These things don't always work out in practice, but the idea is there. Hey, Simon is static. The idea is there. Slavery has no real protections for the enslaved. These distinctions are really important to acknowledge. It's why these things, indentured servitude, serfdom, slavery, have different names, because there are kind of huge differences that have to be accounted for.
Down to the land that they were to the land that they lived in. So I mean, yeah, serfs, kind of difference between a peasant and a serf. Serfs are maybe one step above slaves.
But that's an important
No
distinction.
black man was the first slave owner in America.
I'd heard
as
that rumor,
internet
but
memes are apt to say. The
never
person
felt
they're
confident
referring
teaching
to was an Angolan indentured servant named Anthony Johnson, who in turn came to own indentured servant contracts after he earned his freedom. He even had the first written record of refusing to accept the end of an indentured contract, thereby making the man named John Kacer a legal slave. But there had been slaves in that colony since before the Kacer lawsuit in 1655. African slaves.
Can you see though how that thing could be politicized for people that probably really want to take more of a stance that like, or they don't like the idea of like that it was, you know, like white people.
So if you remember a couple of months back when we talked about this History Legends video about French colonialism, and how he decided to make a distinction of colonial troops in Africa being local, and how this apropos of nothing is supposed to be okay. This is the same kind of idea, really, when you get down to it, is the fact that people would participate in systems does not justify those systems, or automatically justify those systems, rather. So, the other thing to keep in mind is indentured servitude is not slavery. The other thing is, like, for example, in New Orleans, there was a class of people who were half black and half white who did themselves own slaves. The lines are never that simple, but again, this participation in this prevailing system and associating themselves with a particular status, for example, that owning slaves afforded them, does not justify enslavement.
People are, you know, not just the sole bad guys. Kind of reminds me, I'm trying to, I don't think that came up, and I did a video covering.
Well, what it is designed, it's not designed about
slavery.
being the sole bad guys. What it is designed about being is the bad guys in general. If everyone is a bad guy, then there are no bad guys. At least is how the logic goes.
And there was a lot of like apologetics, you know, for like white Americans, and those are the type of things that you would see possibly pop up. That one though I don't remember that being in the video though with Candace Owens.
We're actually making good time on this.
Were sold in 1634 there, and I'm not referring to indentured servants either. I mean straight up slaves. This is normally meant to show that slavery in the New World was colorblind, but that doesn't show it in the slightest.
Not so much in the New World,
actually
though.
based since the second voyage of Columbus. Spanish colonies had been practicing chattel slavery for over a century, including in Florida. It took a while for the racism to build up in the English colonies, but it did so, regardless of who owned the slaves.
The Union fought the Civil War to end slavery. Some myth saying that's what it was about or was not about. It was keeping the Union together. I mean, let's be honest.
The Civil War was not initially fought to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln was very clear in 1862 by stating, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that."
A lot of people say
Which is precisely what he did, but again, I would say the answer is more complicated than that. You can take the entire period of American political history from 1820 to 1860 and say that this is a question. What? Lay down. Okay. We're going to take a short break while I address whatever the problem with Avery is. No, that's the wrong one. I don't know why I still have that one. There, that's the right one. Please enjoy this musical interlude. All right. Yes, I blatantly stole Sunday's music, who Sunday blatantly stole it from someone else. So really, they should take it up with him. Anyway, we are on union and slavery and freedom and complications.
Really? Because like you had these opinions, and you know, with Lincoln and his like campaigning for presidency in 1860, you know, he tried to be very clear about his policies about slavery. Like he was like, "Hey, if I become president, I'm not gonna ban slavery. Like slavery can exist where it is." Right? He would say that thing and made multiple comments about, you know, he didn't necessarily believe that whites and blacks were, you know, equal in any kind of social sense too. And then you can see what he's saying here too, that, you know, the war, it wasn't really about that. But it does become a weapon though of his. And the big thing that you would.
So, if you read about Lincoln, and more importantly, you read about the formation of the Republican Party in general. The Republican Party is opposed to the expansion of slavery. They are opposed to this because it takes away political power from other states and puts it in the hands of the South. This is not a moral crusade for them, at least not at first. Thaddeus Stevens, for example, would be an excellent exception to that rule. But at the same time, Lincoln's feelings on slavery personally and what he would say during an election don't necessarily match up all the time. Was the Civil War fought to end slavery? The stated goal of the federal government at the outset of the war is no. However, we have to take into account the social aspects of this. 1 year prior to the outbreak of the civil election of 1860, and more accurately, the outbreak of the Civil War, in any real sense, you have John Brown's uprising in Virginia. John Brown goes, he tries to free some slaves and start an uprising. Robert E. Lee and the United States Marines come and stop him, and he is captured and put on trial. John Brown immediately begins writing to putting out information, and he's upheld by a whole bunch of people like Thoreau and Emerson, and like he's sort of put as this icon, and everyone starts reading what John Brown says, and like the nation is immensely moved by his conviction that slavery is wrong and that slavery is against the will of God. Not necessarily moved to the point of emancipation and abolition the way he had hoped, but they understand that his conviction is this righteous fury, and it invigorates the nation, and it terrifies the South. And I think if John Brown doesn't start his uprising, he doesn't get captured, and he doesn't, become this national figure overnight, there's a very good chance that we would have continued the sectional crises that had marked the previous decades. These political fights over slavery would have continued for some time, because the South might not necessarily have been so utterly terrified of the sentiments of the North. And in this way, which you see a whole bunch of people volunteering for the Union Army, they are volunteering, sharing in that conviction of John Brown. So the answer is not that simple, really. There's an expectation that slavery gets smashed in the Civil War just for the sheer fact that it harms the South, too, and that they're roundly seen as the villains.
Look at for that, evidence of that would be the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, when we look at it historically, is it's like that is really where slavery kind of makes its way up the chart, or makes its way up the list of reasons for the Civil War. And a lot of people say that's when you knew that that's what really this war was about.
The Emancipation Proclamation was not an easy decision on his part, for there were slave states fighting for the Union. But it was prompted by people like John C. Fremont declaring slaves emancipated under their own authority as military governors.
Yeah, did you know that? That, not all slave states, especially it's interesting because it is very much like where the border ends up.
Yeah, we're going to cut out here because this is really important. Going back into what I just said, the Union Army, A, sees ending slavery and freeing slaves as a military measure, and B, it's popular with Union troops because of this folk sentiment created by John Brown.
The being of the Confederacy and the Union is those border states. Yeah, they hadn't seceded, and interesting of a thing about that is the Emancipation Proclamation didn't go into effect into states that were still part of the Union. It was only supposed to affect states in the Confederacy. And that's also where people are like, Lincoln isn't all in about slavery, because if it was really about slavery, he would have, freed all the slaves. Well, let's remember, too, it's not like the Emancipation Proclamation was presented to the southern states and they're like, oh, our slaves are free. They didn't feel they were, part of the U.S. anymore. They didn't care. He still, and how we know it didn't really matter is he still fought the war.
It also gave a crucial purpose to the Union's fight, as people were becoming more and more disillusioned of the Civil War. Instead, the North fought to keep the Union intact. Ending secession was their chief motivation. Of course, the reason for secession in the first place is a bit different.
All right, the South ceded over states' rights.
Oh boy, is this a thorny issue. I've done an entire episode on the causes of the Civil War, but it is absolutely undeniable that slavery was a chief motivation for secession.
Check out
every document proclaiming secession, slavery is explicitly mentioned.
A lot of slavery in there, huh?
This This is part of lost cause revisionism.
Ooh, Birth
They
of a
try to say
Nation.
that slavery was a minor factor. And that
Famous, now controversial film, one of the earliest popular films, and that blew people away to see this. It was what Woodrow Wilson said. He said this movie was, what was the quote? It's like writing history with lightning. Now it's a pro KKK video. They're like the heroes of it, and there's a lot of reasons. That's one of the main things that a lot of the Wilson critics, of course, like to bring up. But
the North had been trampling over the rights of the South as independent states. They bring up the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which states
they
that
watched
any
it at the White
power
House, too.
expressed by the Constitution would instead be given to the states
People love
rather
to
than
use
the
10th
federal
Amendment for
government. They call out that there
everything
was a tremendous difference in culture and that tariffs were choking farmers. These were all factors for sure.
Birth of a Nation is kind of retroactively about the Civil War. I'll give him that one.
But not the most important one. Lincoln being elected was, and the South's fear of his position on slavery made them secede.
That election's so interesting because you actually had a viable third candidate, and you have four candidates there. But like with with Bell there, if the different political groups outside of Lincoln himself had come together, they would have won the vote. But the Southern Democrats split themselves because
I don't think that's true. Breckinridge, Southern Democratic, key at 72, 180 votes. $72 plus 39 plus 12. 123 electoral votes between all three competitors. Lincoln has 180. Yeah, that's a little hard to say. I don't think I'd go that way. Stephen Douglas he picks up a single state. The popular vote, 29%. Yeah. I don't think it ends up that way, though. Like, pure numbers, sure. But the pure numbers aren't enough to overcome the Electoral College. Otherwise, Hillary Clinton would be president. And not Donald Trump.
Democratic Party was becoming very diverse because they were like pro-slavery, anti-slavery. Their platform was massive. So they split up on those issues, which ended up giving Lincoln, the win.
And the South's
Yeah, but
fear-
Lincoln still takes an overwhelming majority of electoral votes. He just has to win in the same states as before. Like, the proportions don't change substantially. If you take away the Electoral College, sure, but the Electoral College exists. Therefore, that's really not a sustainable, not really sustainable.
of his position on slavery made them secede. Everything else is peripheral to this one problem.
Lincoln didn't
if
have
you
the
want
pop-
more on that,
the
go watch the
over
episode
50%.
that I mentioned before.
He didn't have the majority of votes.
Yes, but he had the votes in the right places. I don't have to get 50% of the vote. It should work out that way, but I don't have to do that. For example, %46% of the vote to 48% of the vote. But it still equates to electoral votes of 304. You see the problem with trying to do it this way? Like, American politics is presidential politics doesn't shake out that neatly.
Exactly. All right, few Southerners
In
owned slaves.
1860, the time of the last census before the Civil War, roughly 36% of freemen in the South owned slaves. That would seem insignificant since they were in the minority overall.
But they have
as
a
one
lot of them have a
article
lot of
pointed out,
slaves.
that is roughly
Some.
the same percentage of Americans with college degrees right now. It is not an insignificant number. Furthermore, the Southern social system was entirely dependent on their peculiar institution. So even if
Yeah,
they
that's right, I
were
really
not
called it.
slave owners, most were heavily entrenched in a way of life that was absolutely dependent on
Right.
slavery.
So it's important to note that, like, yes, a third of Southerners own slaves, and that might be 1 or 2 slaves, and then you have the plantations, which are mass slaves, massively use slave labor. However, the South is socially invested in the concept of superiority over black people, which means that even if you do not own a slave, you can consider yourself superior to the slave while still regarding them as less than human, which is contradictory, but it works out if you're a racist piece of crap. So, enslavement is not necessarily widespread. Only a third of the South's population. But investment in enslavement is much higher. Personal investment and social investment. And this is what animates the Confederacy during the Civil War, particularly those enlisted soldiers who were too poor to own slaves themselves are going to buy into the concept that they are better than a black person, and therefore they should defend the ideals of the Confederacy. And that's really vital to understanding the motivation of the Confederacy.
Yeah, it's not like it was this quiet thing behind the curtain. So even if it was, if you considered 30% to be a low number, it does the impact of slavery on the South itself is way bigger than 30%. It's like he's saying here, it's everything. I mean, and the South truly believed that their entire economy would completely collapse, and probably would have. It would have taken a lot of transition out of that. Industrial Revolution will help with that eventually.
No, I don't think it would. The Confederacy was making plans even before the Civil War had ended to industrialize, to build themselves into a conquering nation, to take Mexico and Cuba, and they were going to do this by industrializing and using that base of slave labor. They probably would have ran into an initial problem where the system is less sustainable, self-sustaining at that point, because you're probably going to have a high die-off rate in this particular period. But they could, free of the Constitution's restrictions, openly start importing slaves again, openly start abducting people again. This would have been a very easy task for them to do and sustain slavery indefinitely if they wanted to.
Factory workers were akin to slaves.
I don't think I've heard this that often
They
either.
weren't personal property.
I've heard this from actual graduate students. Hell, Karl Marx made a similar argument in Das Kapital. It's that tired Marxist terminology of wage slavery.
We haven't been paid in 2 weeks and we want our wages.
Wages? You want to be wage slaves? Answer me that.
No.
No, of course not. Well, what
Wage
makes
slavery
wage
was
slaves?
fair
Wages.
argument.
I want you to be free.
But this is a false equivocation. As I pointed out in class back then, when one possesses different legal rights, it is impossible to say those same people are equal. Slaves had far less legal rights than white.
I don't think I would necessarily out of hand dismiss Marx's argument for slave wages, because Marx is getting at a different point entirely. So that I don't know if that's necessarily a fair distinction, because I think that's kind of an apples and oranges comparison.
White factory workers. In some states, they had no rights
Especially later on in the Industrial Revolution.
whatsoever. If a factory owner whipped their workers, they could be sued or even jailed for assault. As a side
Again,
myth
especially
busting,
later on.
Americans were far more likely to sue each other prior to World War I than ever since. Lawsuits were extraordinarily common in comparison to today, and that myth needs to go away because it is perpetrated by big businesses and benefits them only. Anyways, there were many business practices, such as chaining workers to their factory position, that were decidedly cruel, but that is nothing compared to what many slaves experienced. Now, it is also a myth that all slave owners were cruel and abusive.
Right.
For many, slavery was not as unpleasant as movies like to make it out to be. After all, one had to keep slaves controlled, and love is often a far more potent force of coercion than fear. The various acts of rebellion that were prevalent throughout the history of slavery had to be curtailed somehow, and many masters were kind to their slaves. But the peculiar institution had a corrosive effect on anyone involved.
But it's like kindness to what purpose? Kindness to have a relationship with those slaves, kindness to keep them from revolting, or like true kindness and love for the person. You know what I mean? Because he's saying, you know, that kindness can be or love can be a good way to keep them in control. You wonder what the if people that were, or slave owners that were doing that, to what purpose were they doing it?
No, I don't wonder at all, actually. We know exactly what purpose they were doing it. I also would point out that there's a peculiar balance that you would go if you look at the slave codes of like Virginia, for example, is they have this system that is designed kind of like think of it not terribly dissimilar to an abusive relationship. It is designed to put you in a place, if you are enslaved, where you're in limbo between love and hate, kind of thing, where you're more fearful but yearning for validation. So it's the same kind of structure, just institutionalized for an entire class of people. And like that, it has a very clear intent. It's designed to set up a carrot and a stick in order to justify slavery and to keep slavery as a sustainable system.
All right, soldiers fought for the Confederacy.
It is true that there were slaves who were forced to work for the
You could,
Confederacy.
one thing that was legal back then is you could get somebody to replace you. You got conscripted. You could have somebody could fight in your stead, and that could bring up this situation right here.
There is no record of slaves
That is for the Union and not the Confederacy, and not terribly relevant.
voluntarily working for the
Right.
Confederacy, save for one particular instance. Towards the end of the Civil War, the Confederate Congress passed a bill that allowed for a slave regiment to be created. It was supposedly voluntary, but then again, so was their Conscription Act. And conscription, by no stretch of the definition,
volunteers.
can be defined as voluntary.
Yeah, if you're rich, you're going to be able to get out of the war.
In either case, the regiment that was
Not so much in the South. What ends up happening is that the South's aristocracy functions as officers rather than being able to explicitly get out of the war.
created never saw action, and was a device
Yeah, by the time that the Confederacy authorized the use of slaves as soldiers, the war was over, effectively. They would not have had time to deploy and get that out. The South did not use slaves as soldiers because keeping slaves from having weapons is primarily the purpose of the existence of half of the Confederate Army at any given time during the Civil War. Like, they are outnumbered to begin with, and they had invest huge amounts of soldiers into two things in particular: keeping territories such as Eastern Tennessee, which wanted to join the Union, under control, and keeping slave uprisings from happening. The the Confederacy is not able to employ its full force against anything at any given time because there is this undercurrent of resistance happening.
Decisive issue for
Which is not to say that the Union isn't experiencing Confederate sympathizers, but nowhere near to the degree does it hamper the Union's war effort than it does to the Confederates.
the Confederates in general.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to want to fight with them, too. Africans were captured by Europeans. Some were, yes, but majority were not.
The Colombian slave trade was created by Europeans, and the place that they received slaves was in West Africa. But unlike what is commonly conceived, they did not just go raiding inland with nets to grab up unsuspecting tribesmen. The African slave trade was predicated on Africans selling other Africans.
Yeah. Now, at the beginning in the early part of the slave trade.
So I'm just gonna jump out in front of this one. Yes, this is true. But what I said before still applies. The fact that you participated in a system that disadvantages people with the same identity as you does not validate that system.
Trade. If you want to go as far back as like 1400s, where Portugal was the first to really kind of start doing this for Europeans in this era. That was happening at first, but then obviously, like for Portugal, was not this massive inland power.
Well, it's not even a case of massive inland power. Here's the thing about Africa. Africa is incredibly hostile to you if you do not live in Africa. Most specifically, Europeans aren't able to really mount expeditions into the interior of Africa until they have an effective anti-malarial drug. So, in order for this to work at all, they require cooperation from local forces who go out, who are already fighting wars and raiding and doing these things. And they're engaging in all these activities that humans do. And they see an opportunity to profit from it. But again, and I must stress this, the fact that these things occur does not justify them.
They didn't have the means to go and have high success rates of going into an African nation, and these were mighty nations and actually enslaving people. But yeah, found out far more profitable actually and efficient to buy the slaves from African slave or African kingdoms that could do that on their own part. They could get captives and then sell them. So
It was a system already in place before Columbus arrived to take the first slaves to the New World in 1498. Like most slave institutions, it was created by capturing prisoners during warfare. Europeans had no need to kidnap Africans, like they show in movies all the time. Africans were already doing that for them.
Africans have been enslaving each other before that. Long before that. In fact, the Islamic trade, the Indian Ocean, there was a slave trade in the Indian Ocean where, Islamic slave traders were doing this. What the Europeans did largely is entered into an already existing system, and not just because.
So, Sun Aesthetic, I kind of guess I get where you're coming from as it being weird. Here's the thing. I do not unilaterally like the certain concepts that we are trying to push in pop history today. I don't, for instance, like the concept of the colonizer outside of a very specific set of examples. I don't like the concept of of not pointing out how these systems work and are interdependent. The reason that I would address this myth, and I think anyone who's responsible would address this particular myth, is because there is a degree to which a not acknowledging it makes us complicit in not understanding it. So we have to acknowledge those difficult facts, and we have to be able to say and stand up against that conservative narrative that says participation is tacit approval. Because it isn't. We need to sit with the uncomfortable parts of history in order to get to a place where we can undo the damage they've done.
Because of the Islamic slave trade, because they're going in West Africa, where a lot of that Indian Ocean slave trade network was happening in East Africa, but Africans also enslaved other Africans in West Africa before this.
Developed an entire economy around that trade. This devastated Western Africa, which has yet to recover from the economic circumstances imposed by the transatlantic slave trade. That doesn't vindicate Europeans for their slave trading, of course.
You know, one of the effects, interestingly, is because slave traders were more interested in men, like men as slaves. I think like 2/3, I forget the exact number, about were men. That actually really screwed up the gender ratios in Africa, where there were more women than men, and that affected like marriages as well. So you could marry, because there's more women than men. Men could have more wives if you didn't get enslaved.
Wrongs don't make a right, let alone how Europeans would encourage the trade through their economic incentives and political maneuvering in Africa. It was a lucrative business after all. It just means that Africans were active participants in the trade and not only victims of it.
It's both. White people ended slavery. This was one of the arguments that came up in that PragerU video with Candace Owens. They were saying, again,
It'll be a long, 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 long time before I am ever willing to do a PragerU video. Could you blame child soldiers? No. Child soldiers are a phenomena throughout history, irrespective of place and period.
European powers to ban it. Like that cancels it out.
Well, slavery is still an ongoing issue. Many countries throughout the world have clear slavery, and not just coerced labor like Chinese factory workers. I mean, chattel slavery still exists.
We weren't allowed to be reporting on slavery. It's a practice the government tries to hide from outsiders. But as we would find, slavery is everywhere in Mauritania, if you know where to look.
It is illegal worldwide, but practiced anyways in a number of countries, so slavery has not ended. Furthermore, abolishment of slavery was not an invention of white people. The Qing dynasty were the first recorded abolitionists. They are the reason why we call that country China. And the first Chinese emperor was an abolitionist. Slavery fluctuated.
And that dude was brutal. Qin Shuangdi, absolutely brutal. But yeah, abolished it. That's amazing.
Throughout world history. The idea that slavery is inherently wrong does not originate in Europe, nor is it particularly unique there. Right. Abolition was also motivated by slave revolt.
Yeah, China is very uniquely... Chinese history is really interesting, and it's not something I specialize in. Something I've done like a lot of broad overviews of. Chinese history, like, odds are very good if we think we thought of something. China did it first, did it thousands of years ago.
Slaves were not just docile servants, but often actively opposed their own enslavement. Slave revolts happened throughout the modern period, one of which culminated in the liberation of Haiti, long before most European countries abolished slavery. Yeah. Even when they were forced into the most wretched conditions possible aboard ship on the Middle Passage, there were around 250 shipboard slave revolts. It was such a problem that slave ships often had barricades to defend themselves against such revolts. There's also a kind of disgusting side to claiming that whites freed the slaves. For how wonderful it is that the captors freed the captives. How nice of them to just decide on their own volition to stop oppressing people.
Let's also remember that some of the times or the instances where slavery was abolished was also a time where slaves were becoming less important as well, especially as the Industrial Revolution was growing.
This is a particularly pernicious myth because it makes slaves objects rather than actors in their own right, as well as completely forgetting the Western powers were particularly egregious when it came to the abolition of slavery. All of these myths need to be stopped.
All right. Final thoughts, and I want your thoughts. Okay, great video. I think these types of videos where you address common misconceptions are probably among the most important video content and content that can come out about history, because there are so many of them. And if you're somebody that's watching videos like this, I already know, just based on if you're actually using your YouTube time to watch videos like this, that you probably believe that too. And I think the slavery one is a great one to look at for this. So I did ask you all at the beginning of the video, or if any of these myths were things you vividly remember being taught. Not just saying just kind of you've heard of it, but like actively remember it being taught. Interested to know what you're hearing in your schools, right? So of course, as a teacher, my job is always to try to know what is most likely true and most likely untrue. So I think us as educators, it's very, very important for us to do that. Even if there's backlash, which can happen as a history teacher, teaching things that again might be a common misconception, and because of that, people may view that like we're lying or something like that. So we're all a part of this, though. As learners, as teachers, we're all a part and need to be a part of breaking apart myths. Anyway, so this was fantastic. Great job by Cypher over with Cynical Historian. This is one of his more popular videos. But again, very good, very academic content coming from him as someone coming through academia. And if you like that, I hope you do, the scholarly backing, then make sure you're subbing over there. I know you won't regret it. All right.
Okay. I was taught Africans capturing Africans sing as a main cause of American slavery. Yes, that has been used as an excuse for slavery in the past. The fact that it is truth speaks to something larger, though, I think. That we don't really get into the methodology of how a country takes over another country. So, like, it would be expected to a certain extent that given the fact that a country sets up a colony and then trades with another country on the borders of that colony, that I would expect you to see that kind of participation where the locals are taking the things that those traders want and giving it to them. It's not uncommon. So it's not a surprise, really, if you study history. We've been going for almost 2.5 hours. That's probably good for this evening. Couple housekeeping items before I go. We're going to be doing the first study hall stream next week based off of the poll. What I'm going to do is throw out some topics for everyone to vote on at the YouTube community page. And as long as you pick the right one, we'll do that one. If you don't and we're not prepared for that one, we won't do that one. What will end up happening more broadly is next week we should be doing the Second American Civil War militia pamphlet book thing. Whenever I set that time with Hetman, and hopefully we'll be picking up the Iraq War bit too. So, I'm just getting something ready that I didn't get ready before. Don't mind me. So that's really the end of that particular thing. We will be scheduling it out. Like I said before, we're going to try to do more streams per week and at least one VOD per week going forward. If you want to help out, down in the description box, you will find our donation link. We appreciate donations. The other one we will have is going forward is our Patreon. You can join our free Patreons every month, and eventually we'll build this into a nice little empire. With that said, I am going to close this out. Please go ahead and have a good evening. Stay safe. And if you haven't liked the stream or subscribed, please like and subscribe. And here's our new closing title card.